The urinary system's main purpose is to maintain the body's homeostasis. In other words, its main function is to maintain the body's acid-base balance. It's important to know the human organism was meant to stay healthy, and systems such as the urinary, digestive, skin, and other vital organ systems were created for that purpose. They are designed to keep the body healthy and able to withstand diseases. The urinary system, much like the integumentary system, doesn't have many parts, but they are truly essential to the survival of the human organism. Let's take a look at the basic anatomical structures of the urinary system. They are 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 bladder, 1 urethra, and the urethra meatus. Now the 2 kidneys are bean-shaped in appearance. They are located on either side of the vertebral column behind the upper part of the abdominal cavity. The kidneys are protected by the ribs and a heavy cushion of fat called the adipose capsule. They are literally suspended in the body, meaning unattached to any other major organ. Each kidney is divided into 2 main sections, the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is the outer section of the kidney. It contains the majority of nephrons. Nephrons are microscopic filtering units. These filtering units are composed of the following structures: a glomerulus, a Bowman's capsule, a proximal convoluted tubule, and a distal convoluted tubule, and a collecting duct. Together, these structures purify the blood by removing excess water, salt, sugar, metabolic products, and other substances the body needs to purge in order to maintain the pH acid-base balance and thus the homeostasis of the body. Now the medulla is the intersection of the kidney. It contains most of the collecting tubules, which carry the urine from the nephrons through the kidney to the ureters. The ureters are 2 muscular tubes approximately 10 to 12 inches long and extending from the renal pelvis of each kidney to the bladder. Now the bladder is a hollow sac, much like the stomach, lined by a series of folds called ruga. The purpose of these folds is to allow the bladder to expand as urine is collected. The bladder typically holds up to 1 cup of urine and sometimes more until the urge to void or urinate is turned on. Leading from the bladder is the urethra tube. Its job is to carry the urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. The last structure in the urinary pathway of purging toxins from the body is the external opening to the urethra. This is called the urethra meatus. Now here's a very important note to make about the urethra and the sexes. In females, the urethra is only about 1.5 inches long, and it is separate from the reproductive system. While in the males, the urethra is approximately 8 inches long, and before the urine exits, it goes through the prostate gland. The urethra in the male is used by 2 body systems, the urinary and the reproductive. Only urine passes through the urethra in the urinary system, but in the reproductive system, only semen passes through. Urine and semen will never pass at the same time through the male's urethra. So what exactly is urine? Urine is the waste product that the urinary system is responsible for eliminating from the body. It's 95% water, and the other 5% is made up of urea, uric acid, creatine, mineral salts, various pigments, and sugar. Excess sugar found in the urine can be indicative of diabetes. In a day's work, the kidney can filter up to 150 quarts of liquid, resulting in about 1.5 to 2 quarts of urine. That's if you're drinking the proper amount of water. Now before we finish, let's go over it one more time. The basic purpose for this system is to cleanse the blood. It filters out toxins such as excess sugars and salts, as well as other substances. The main structures or anatomical parts are 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 bladder, 1 urethra, and the urethra meatus. Each kidney is divided into the cortex and medulla. Inside the cortex of both kidneys are thousands of microscopic filtering units called nephrons. And remember, it's important to drink lots of water in order for the kidneys and the urinary system to continue to function properly.
The workhorses of the urinary system are the kidneys, which are the twin bean-shaped organs in your body that clear harmful substances by filtering your blood. They're like a water purification plant that helps clean the drinking water for a city. They also regulate blood pH, volume, pressure, osmolality, as well as produce hormones. The kidneys are located between the T12 and L3 vertebrae, and they're partially protected by ribs 11 and 12, which are the floating ribs. The kidneys are roughly the size of a fist and are retroperitoneal, meaning they sit behind the peritoneal membrane, alongside the vertebral column. The right kidney is pushed down by the liver, so it sits slightly lower than the left kidney. In the middle of each kidney, there's an indentation that forms the renal hilum. This is the entry and exit point for the ureter, renal artery and renal vein, lymphatics, and nerves going into and coming out of the kidney. The kidney is surrounded by 3 layers of tissue. On the outside is the renal fascia, which is a thin layer of dense connective tissue that anchors the kidney to its surroundings. The middle layer, or adipose capsule, is a fatty layer that protects the kidney from trauma. And the deepest layer, called the renal capsule, is a smooth, transparent sheet of dense connective tissue that gives the kidney its distinctive shape. If you take a cross-section of the kidney, there are 2 main parts. The inner portion is the renal medulla, and the outside rim is the renal cortex. The medulla is made up of 10 to 18 renal pyramids, with the base of the pyramids facing the renal cortex and the tips of the pyramid, called renal papilla, or nipples, pointing toward the center of the kidney. The renal papilla project into minor calyces, which join together to form major calyces which funnel into the renal pelvis. Urine collects in the renal pelvis and then heads out of the kidney through the ureter. The renal cortex can be divided into an outer cortical zone and an inner juxtamedullary zone. There are also sections of the cortex called renal columns, which extend down into the medulla, separating the renal pyramids from each other. Each renal pyramid and the renal cortex above it is called a renal lobe. So an adult's kidneys filter about 150 liters of blood every day. If we assume that there are 5 liters of blood in the body, that means that the entire blood volume gets filtered about 30 times a day, which is more than once every hour. Because of this, the kidneys get about a quarter of the cardiac output, which is blood getting pumped out of the left ventricle. To reach the kidneys, blood flows from the aorta into the left and right renal arteries. As these renal arteries enter the kidney, they divide into segmental arteries, and then into interlobar arteries, which pass through the renal columns, then to arcuate arteries that go over the bases of the renal pyramids, and then into the cortical radiate arteries, which supply the cortex. The cortical radiate arteries continue to divide, eventually forming afferent arterioles that split into a tiny bundle of capillaries called the glomerulus. And the glomerulus is the site where blood filtration starts. Interestingly, once the blood leaves these glomeruli, it doesn't enter the venules. Instead, the glomerulus funnels blood into efferent arterioles, which divide into capillaries a second time. These paratubular capillaries then reunite to become the cortical radiate veins, then the arcuate veins, then interlobar veins, and then finally into the left and right renal veins, which connect to the inferior vena cava. The flow of the veins are similar to the arteries, but in reverse. The only difference is that there's a segmental artery, but no segmental vein. Within each kidney, there are about 1 million nephrons, and each nephron is made up of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. The renal corpuscle is where blood filtration starts, and it includes the glomerulus, which is the tiny bed of capillaries, and the Bowman's capsule, which is made of renal cells that surround the glomerulus. As blood flows into the glomerulus, water and some solutes in the blood, like sodium, are able to pass through the endothelial lining of the capillary, move across its basement membrane, through the epithelial lining of the nephron, and finally into the Bowman space of the nephron itself, at which point it's called filtrate. The epithelium of the nephron is made of specialized cells called podocytes, which wrap around the basement membrane like the tentacles of an octopus. Between these tentacle-like projections are tiny gaps called filtration slits that act like a sieve, allowing only small particles like water, glucose, and ionic salts to pass through, while blocking large proteins and red blood cells. As the filtrate leaves the Bowman's capsule, it flows into the renal tubule, which is surrounded by the peritubular capillaries. Now, before we dive too far in here, let's redraw the nephron so that the structure of the renal tubule is a little more accurate. Alright, so the renal tubule itself can be divided into the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, also known as the loop of Henle, which is made up of the descending limb and the ascending limb, the distal convoluted tubule, and finally the collection ducts, which ultimately send the urine to the minor calyces. Here the filtrate becomes fine-tuned, based on what the body wants to keep versus what it wants to discard, with water and solutes getting passed back and forth between the filtrate and the lumen of the renal tubule and the blood in the peritubular capillaries. Each nephron also has a really unique region called the juxtaglomerular complex, which is involved in the regulation of blood pressure and the glomerular filtration rate, or the amount of blood that passes through the glomeruli each minute. The juxtaglomerular complex is located between the distal convoluted tubule and the afferent arteriole. There are 3 types of cells in the juxtaglomerular complex: macula densa cells, juxtaglomerular cells, and extraglomerular mesangial cells. Macula densa cells are located in the distal convoluted tubule, and they can sense when levels of sodium and chloride are low. So in the case of hypovolemia and hypotension, the macula densa cells sense the low sodium and chloride levels and send a signal over to the juxtaglomerular cells, which are located in the wall of the afferent arteriole. The extraglomerular mesangial cells help with the signaling between macula densa cells and juxtaglomerular cells. The juxtaglomerular cells then receive the signal, and also independently sense the low pressure in the blood vessels, and secrete an enzyme called renin, which increases sodium reabsorption. And this helps raise the blood volume. Renin also causes constriction of blood vessels, which helps raise the blood pressure. Once millions of nephrons have each made urine, it flows into the minor calyces, then major calyces, and finally into the renal pelvis. From there it goes down the ureter, which has a muscular lining which helps push the urine along. The ureters insert into the bladder at the ureterovesical junction, at a sideways angle so that when the bladder becomes full, it compresses the openings to the ureters and prevents backflow of urine. It's basically a one-way valve that prevents urine from refluxing backwards from the bladder into the ureters. The bladder itself is like a balloon. Its muscular wall has tons of folds, called rugae, that can contract when the bladder's emptied of urine and can expand when it's filled with urine. In the layers of the bladder wall are a mucosa layer that has a transitional epithelium, which is stretchy and allows the bladder to distend while maintaining a barrier between urine and the body. In addition, there's a thick muscular layer called the detrusor muscle that helps with bladder contraction during urination, and it has a fibrous adventitia outer layer. In women, the bladder is in front of the vagina, uterus, and rectum, and in men, the bladder is just in front of the rectum. On average, the bladder can hold around 750 milliliters of urine, or about the volume of a bottle of wine. Slightly less in women, though, because of crowding from the uterus, and that's especially true during pregnancy. The floor of the bladder has a smooth triangular region called the trigone region, with 2 corners at the ureterovesical junctions and the third corner being the internal urethral orifice, where the bladder meets the urethra. The trigone region is very sensitive to expansion, and once it stretches to a certain point, the bladder sends a signal to the brain that it's time to pee. The urethra is a thin, muscular tube that drains urine from the bladder, starting from the internal urethral orifice to the external opening. In males, the urethra first passes through the prostate, where it's called the prostatic urethra, and then it passes through deep muscles of the peritoneum, where it's called the intermediate urethra, and finally passes through the penis, where it's called the spongy urethra. The male urethra is also used during ejaculation, except there semen enters into the urethra via the seminal vesicles. In women, the urethra runs through the perineal floor of the pelvis and exits between the two labia minora, above the vaginal opening and below the clitoris in an area called the vulval vestibule. In men and women, around the internal urethral orifice, the detrusor muscle thickens to form the internal sphincter. This involuntary sphincter is controlled by the autonomic nervous system and keeps the urethra closed when the bladder isn't full. Additionally, there's an external sphincter at the level of the urogenital diaphragm in the floor of the pelvis, which is under voluntary control. By contracting the skeletal muscles around the external sphincter, urination can be stopped voluntarily. This is called a Kegel exercise, and it can be done to strengthen the pelvic floor. The act of urination involves close coordination between the nervous system and the muscles of the bladder. Once the volume of the bladder is greater than about 300 to 400 milliliters, basically when it's half full, pressure on the bladder walls increases, and that sends signals to the urination or micturition center in the spinal cord, located at S2 and S3. This sets off a reflex arc called the micturition reflex, which causes contraction of the bladder and relaxation of the internal sphincter and external sphincter. Now, the pontine storage center and the pontine micturition center are two areas in the pons part of your brain that help control urination. When you can't find a toilet and want to hold your urine in, then you activate the pontine storage center, and that stops the micturition reflex. When you finally do find that toilet and you're ready to urinate, the pontine micturition center is active, and it allows the micturition reflex to happen, and you can finally pee. Alright, as a quick recap, the kidney's main function is to filter all of the body's blood about 30 times a day, and to produce urine. The urine passes down through the ureters and into the bladder. As the urine collects in the bladder, it increases the pressure on the bladder wall and the micturition reflex is triggered. This allows the urine to flow through the urethra and out the body.
A lot of the cleanup that comes after metabolism is handled by the liver, which plays a tremendous role in directing dead cells and leftover chemicals to the digestive and urinary systems. But your liver can't actually escort waste out of your person. Your lungs can lend a hand exhaling carbon dioxide, and of course your colon will eventually poop out unusable stuff and old cell parts. But much of your chemical waste still needs to be sorted and disposed of, so one system steps in to bat cleanup. And that is your urinary system. This system, and specifically your kidneys, does all sorts of important homeostatic stuff like regulating your water volume, ion salt concentrations, and pH levels, and influencing your red blood cell production and blood pressure. But its main purpose, what we're going to be focusing on for the next 2 lessons, is how it filters toxic leftovers from your blood, like nitrogenous waste made by metabolizing protein, and ferries it out of the body. Now, you probably know that kidneys are filters. Most of what's in your blood is totally removed by the kidneys, then your body pulls back what it wants to hold on to before the rest is sent on a one-way trip to the bladder. It's kind of like this. You don't clean out your fridge by just taking out the rotten fruit and fuzzy leftovers. Instead, you gotta take everything out and put it on the counter and then sort through what goes back into the fridge and what goes in the trash. That's how your urinary system cleans you up, and it is really good at its job. So this morning, I decided to go the healthy route, and instead of eating my normal breakfast of nothing, I had a big 32-ounce protein smoothie. My digestive system did its thing, and all the protein was hydrolyzed into amino acids, which were absorbed by my blood and sent all over my body to build and repair cells. It's a beautiful thing, but not without consequence, because metabolizing nutrients, especially protein, makes a mess. You may remember that amino acids are unique in that they have nitrogen in their amine groups, and because we can't store amino acids, extra ones get processed into storable carbs or fats. But the amine group isn't used in those storage molecules, so it's converted to NH3, or ammonia, which happens to be toxic. So the liver converts the ammonia into a less toxic compound, urea, which our kidneys filter out into our pee. Once out of the body, urea can degrade back into ammonia, which is why dirty pee-soaked toilets and cat litter boxes smell like ammonia. Now, this business of taking out the nitrogenous trash is one of the urinary system's biggest jobs. Its other major duty is to regulate the balance of salt and water in your blood, and both of these tasks are processed processed in the whole system of tubes that is your urinary system. So let's take a look at some basic pee-making anatomy. Your kidneys are a pair of dark red, fist-sized, bean-shaped organs that sit on each side of your spine against the posterior body wall. Kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means they lie between the dorsal wall and the peritoneum, the membrane that surrounds the abdominal cavity, rather than inside the cavity itself, like your intestines and stomach do. Each kidney has 3 distinct layers, beginning with the outermost cortex. Beneath that is the medulla, a set of cone-shaped masses of tissue that secrete urine into tiny sac-like tubules. And finally, the innermost layer is the renal pelvis, a funnel-shaped tube surrounded by smooth muscle that uses peristalsis to move urine out of the kidney into the ureter and into the bladder. Because the kidney's main job is to continuously filter blood, they end up seeing a lot of it. In fact, at any given moment, they hold over 20% of your total blood volume. Oxygenated blood enters the kidney through the large renal arteries, which deliver nearly a quarter of all blood pumped through the heart every minute. That means your kidneys filter about 120 to 140 liters of blood every day. As they enter the kidneys, renal arteries branch many times, ending in tons of little capillary groups. So a kidney isn't just one big filter. Instead, each one is made up of about 1 million twisty microscopic filtering units called nephrons. Structurally and functionally, nephrons are where the real business of blood processing, much like pee-making, begins, in 3 steps: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Each nephron consists of a round renal corpuscle that resides up in the cortex, followed by a long and winding renal tubule that loops around between the cortex and the medulla. The outer part of the corpuscle is a cup-shaped feature called the glomerular capsule, because inside it there's a whole tangle of capillaries called the glomerulus. That's from the Latin word for ball of yarn, which is pretty much what it looks like. And the endothelium of these capillaries is very porous, so they allow lots of fluid, waste products, ions, glucose, and amino acids to pass from the blood into the capsule. But they block out bigger molecules like blood cells and proteins, so they stay in the blood and exit through the peritubular capillaries, also known as the vasa recta. Now all the stuff that gets squeezed out of the blood into the glomerulus is called filtrate, which is then sent along the elaborately twisting 3-centimeter long renal tubule. Even though it looks like just a tube, it actually has 3 major parts, some of which are permeable to certain substances but not others. First is the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, which is about as convoluted looking as its name suggests. Then the tube drops into a dramatic hairpin turn called the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle, a term that I like better personally. And finally it ends in the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, which empties into a collecting duct. All this twisting might make the tubule look like super inefficient, but it actually serves an important purpose, as you might expect. Just like with your small intestines, the long, curly shape of the nephron provides more time and space for it to reabsorb whatever usable stuff it can. And this meandering path also allows the parts of the tubule that are toward the end to have an effect on processes that take place closer to the beginning as they pass each other. Because a lot of the stuff that winds up in the tube are valuable commodities, like ions and glucose and water, and we don't want to just pee all of them out if we can help it. So let's trace the whole process, starting at the top with the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT. The walls here are made of cuboidal epithelial cells with big ol' mitochondria that make ATP to power pumps that pull lots of sodium ions from the filtrate using active transport. These cells also are covered in microvilli that increase their surface area and help reabsorb much of the good stuff from the filtrate back into the blood. The remaining filtrate passes from the PCT into the loop of Henle, which starts in the cortex, then dips into the medulla before coming back into the cortex. And the form of this loop is key to its function, because its primary task is to drive the reabsorption of water by creating a salt concentration gradient in the tissue of the medulla. It does this mainly by actively pumping out salts in the ascending limb. This creates some very salty interstitial fluid in the medulla, so when new filtrate comes down the descending loop in front of it, water passively flows out and into the super salty interstitial space. Since most of this water is picked up by the blood pretty quickly, the saltiness of the interstitial space doesn't get diluted, so it can keep drawing water out of the next batch of filtrate in the descending limb. Needless to say, this is super important, because if we peed out all the water that went into our kidneys, we would die of dehydration really quick. But even after all that, we are still only 2/3 of the way through the process. As we move out of the loop of Henle into the distal convoluted tubule and onto the collecting duct, the remaining filtrate is now officially urine. But there's one more component that we have to squeeze the most out of before we excrete the stuff: urea. Even though we think of urea as a waste product, just one more part of that protein shake that has to be dumped, the kidneys actually need it. They use it to ramp up the concentration gradient earlier in the process, making the medulla even saltier for the filtrate that's back there going through the ascending limbs. When the final steps, after the filtrate leaves the DCT, it enters the collecting duct, which runs back into the medulla. And while the salt passively draws even more water out of the collecting duct, some urea passively leaves the urine as well, making the medulla even more salty, and in turn more effective at drawing out water from the ascending limb a few steps back. So there's essentially a traveling pool of urea that escapes the urine, finds its way back into the loop of Henle, and then runs the whole course again back to the collecting duct, an ammonia-scented cycle called urea recycling. Now all that's left is a kind of last call to selectively sneak out any extra waste like hydrogen, potassium, and certain organic acids and bases using active transport. This is called tubular secretion, and it transports only select kinds of waste that have already made their way into the blood that's in the paratubular capillaries ready to leave the kidneys. This step is kind of like emptying your pockets of any last wads of tissue or crumpled receipts as you're walking a bag of trash to the curb. And that's how your kidneys clean up the mess left over from the giant party that is you metabolizing food. So if you thought that your kidneys were just a kind of fine mesh that filtered out bad stuff, now you know that that's not true. If you thought your urinary system was basically a matter of water goes in, pee goes out, that's definitely not true. And if you thought we were done talking about your urine, that is also not true, because next time we're going to be learning how your body regulates what's absorbed and what's excreted, and we'll find out what can happen when that regulation goes awry. Anatomists call it micturition, and I don't know why, because the rest of us call it urination, which seems like a fine word. All mammals and most animals urinate to remove toxins and to help maintain water volume homeostasis, or blood pressure. And while some of us spray it around to attract mates or mark territory or deter predators, as far as I know, only humans actually study pee. In fact, we've been doing it for thousands of years. Even before Hippocrates extolled the diagnostic virtues of pee sniffing, early Sumerian and Babylonian physicians were making urine-related observations. Medieval doctors as well diagnosed diseases based on smelling, inspecting, even tasting urine samples, and although they were often totally off base, which makes me feel bad for those guys who sipped urine for no reason, they were kind of onto something. Today, urological tests can help detect a lot of ailments based on the color, the smell, the clarity, and chemical composition of a sample. Freshly peed urine is usually around 95% water, slightly acidic with a pH of around 6, a little bit aromatic, and usually somewhere between clear and dark yellow in color, depending on your level of hydration. Urine also contains over 3,000 different chemical compounds, and their varying levels of concentration can tell us a lot about what's going on in the body. If you give it to a doctor, and they can see that it's cloudy with white blood cells, that's a good sign you've got a urinary tract infection. If it smells sweet and contains a lot of glucose, you might have diabetes. If it looks pink, then unless you've recently eaten beets, you probably have internal bleeding somewhere. And if it's chock full of proteins, you could be pregnant, or working out too hard, or have high blood pressure, or be headed to heart failure. So as you can see, even if the most thought you've given to the subject is to wonder if you should pee now or wait to the end of the movie, the whole process of producing, storing, and eliminating pee is nowhere near as simple as it may seem. From osmotic pressure to stretch receptors to hormones, our circulatory, nervous, and endocrine systems regulate how much urine we produce, what goes into it, and when to get rid of it. Last time we discussed how your kidneys filter your blood, but the actual production of urine can be affected by a whole host of factors. One thing that might have crossed your mind last time is the production of urine must, by its very nature, be influenced by blood, specifically its volume and its pressure. Because step 1 in pee making is the process of glomerular filtration, where blood is filtered in the little blood-filled balls of yarn that are the glomeruli. So just like water in a hose, higher pressure in the blood must push more plasma out of the capillaries and into the glomeruli. But here's a problem. Your kidneys can only handle so much filtrate at a time, so they have to maintain a constant rate of flow inside of them. This is known as the glomerular filtration rate, or how much blood passes through the glomeruli every minute. And your kidneys have ways of regulating this rate despite changes in blood pressure. If your blood pressure happens to increase, for example, the higher pressure causes the arterioles leading to your glomeruli to stretch. And then the smooth muscle in the walls of the glomeruli respond to this stretching stimulus by constricting, automatically reducing the amount of blood flow into the glomeruli and leaving the flow rate relatively unchanged. This kind of intrinsic control or autoregulation is helpful in controlling the filtration rate through normal ranges of blood pressures, but the kidneys mostly regulate urine concentration at the other end of the nephron tubules. This kind of regulation I'm sure you're familiar with. If you've ever had too much coffee or gone on a bit of a bender, you may have experienced the pleasure of having to pee every 5 minutes. That's because your endocrine system has a lot to say about your bathroom breaks, so you have some strong hormonal mechanisms that affect when and how often you go. And as it happens, both caffeine and alcohol inhibit the release of one of these hormones, called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland to help the body retain water and stay hydrated. How ADH works is kind of complex, but first let's remember that cell membranes are generally not that permeable to water, but in the parts of the nephron that reabsorb water, like the descending limb of the loop of Henle, water has to move easily through cells from the filtrate into the blood. This is possible because of special protein channels in the membranes called aquaporins that are both on the apical, or filtrate-facing side, and the basal, or capillary-facing side of the cells. By contrast, the cells lining the collecting duct only have aquaporins on the basal side, so not a lot of reabsorption takes place there usually. But ADH triggers those cells to move aquaporins they have in storage over to the apical side, which allows more water to leave the urine. And since caffeine and alcohol inhibit ADH, that means no moving aquaporins, which means very little water reabsorption and ultimately tons of peeing and dehydration. So yeah, lots of factors affect the production of urine. But once it's produced, it doesn't just leave the building. It has to be moved and stored until the time is right. Once the urine leaves the kidneys, it enters the ureters, a pair of slender tubes that drop down to the posterior urinary bladder. Contrary to what you might think, your ureters aren't just passive tubes, and your pee doesn't just wind up in the bladder because of gravity alone. Rather, like the small intestines, each ureter features a layer of smooth muscle that contracts to move urine using peristalsis. The frequency and strength of these peristaltic waves varies depending on how fast urine is being produced, and a series of valves prevent pee from backing up, making sure that instead it reaches the bladder. The bladder is a hollow, collapsible sac that temporarily stores urine. Like the kidneys, it's retroperitoneal, located posterior to the pubic bone and anterior to the rectum. The bladder wall consists of 3 layers: an inner mucosa surrounded by a thick muscular layer called the detrusor, wrapped in a fibrous protective outer membrane. The inner mucosal layer consists of transitional epithelium, which allows the bladder to expand so it can hold more urine, a handy feature for social mammals like us who prefer dry underwear and peeing in private. When it's empty, it collapses into a triangular shape, folding up on itself like a deflated balloon. Then, as urine accumulates, the bladder thins and expands into a pear shape, and all those folds disappear. A full bladder can comfortably hold around 500 milliliters of pee, though it can usually expand to hold a maximum of around 1 liter. At that point, though, you're pushing your luck, because prolonged overdistension could, in theory, lead to a burst bladder, although you would probably just pee your pants first. But let's assume for the sake of polite conversation that you have found an appropriate location to relieve yourself. Your urine enters the thin but muscular urethra by passing through the internal urethral sphincter. Now, we don't actually have voluntary control over this particular sphincter, but the autonomic nervous system keeps it cinched up whenever you're not peeing to prevent leakage. Once the urine is through the sphincter, it heads down through the urogenital diaphragm, which includes the last stop, the external urethral sphincter, which is probably the one that you're familiar with because it's made of skeletal muscles and is the one that you control voluntarily. Only now are we finally ready to explore the act of micturition itself, the actual excretion of urine. Urination. As the pee from your morning coffee builds up, it causes the bladder to push out, activating the stretch receptors in its walls. The resulting nerve impulses zip along afferent fibers to the sacral region of the spinal cord, along interneurons and toward the brain, eventually exciting the parasympathetic neurons and inhibiting the sympathetic system. This tells the detrusor to contract while the internal urethral sphincter simultaneously opens and the external sphincter relaxes so that the pee can flow out. This, you may or may not recall, is kind of an acquired skill. When you're a baby, those stretch receptor impulses trigger a simple spinal reflex that coordinates this whole process, and you have no real control over when you pee. But within a couple of years of birth, your brain's circuits have developed the ability to override simple reflexive urination and to choose a different neural pathway. So how's that possible? Well, an area of your brainstem called the pons contains 2 different centers that lock down your urination control, or lack of it. There's the pontine storage area, which inhibits urination, and the pontine micturition center, which gives it the green light. As your bladder fills up, impulses triggered by stretch receptors head to the pons and other higher brain centers that give you the conscious feeling that you have to pee. If your bladder isn't full and you're too busy to find a bathroom, it mostly activates the pontine storage area that keeps you from peeing by inhibiting your parasympathetic activity and increasing sympathetic output. Of course, the longer you hold it, the more your bladder fills up, and eventually the need to pee becomes too strong to ignore, at which point the pontine micturition center jumps into action, overriding the previous orders and opening the sphincter so you can finally tinkle. And that's how your own personal waterworks works.